Muito bem, gente. Nós estamos aí, né, com alegria hoje, privilégio de entrevistar um dos autores de comentários mais renomados, né, do mundo evangélico, o Dr. Douglas Moo, e vamos falar sobre o seu comentário de Romanos. O Dr. Douglas Moo é um homem enorme, de 2 metros, né, não cabe na tela aqui, 2 metros de altura, 2 metros de rigor exegético, e ele espera isso nos trabalhos dos seus alunos. Eu tive o privilégio de ter uma disciplina com ele no Trinity, perto de Chicago, Deerfield, nos Estados Unidos. 2 metros de rigor exegético que ele espera dos seus alunos também nos seus trabalhos e, ao mesmo tempo, 2 metros de generosidade com os alunos. Eu sou testemunha disso. Eu tive essa disciplina com ele no primeiro semestre do ano 2000, quando eu fiz um ano de doutorado lá, e foi o seu último semestre no seminário Trinity. Depois ele passou para o Wheaton College, onde ele está até hoje. Diz que vai se aposentar agora no fim deste semestre. Aprendi muito com ele, fui muito desafiado com ele. Acabei de conversar com ele um pouco sobre isso agora. Ele tinha o sistema de a gente entregar os trabalhos por escrito numa aula antes da apresentação. Aí na aula seguinte era a apresentação, ele já tinha lido, fazia seus comentários, os colegas também, depois eu recebi o trabalho e tive então a oportunidade de aproveitar todas aquelas orientações. Um dia eu faço um vídeo só sobre isso, aquelas orientações que ele deu para melhorar o trabalho e entregar 2 semanas depois, e realmente melhorou bastante, a nota foi bem melhor depois. Ele foi coordenador muitos anos, já vou confirmar com ele se continua, na comissão de tradução da NVI em inglês, né? E ele é nosso conhecido em Edições Vida Nova já há muitos anos, né? Já conhecemos, por exemplo, o comentário de Tiago, né? Nessa versão aqui, a versão bem antiga, se eu não me engano é de 85, que nós publicamos na série das bolinhas. Tem também um bem mais recente de Tiago, que saiu pela Publicações Shed, né, o comentário de Tiago também. Também o conhecemos da introdução, a introdução junto com Donald Carson e com Leon Morris, né, que ele escreveu em conjunto com esses 2 autores. E também no comentário de um só volume da Vida Nova, em que o Dr. Moo é o autor da seção que trata de Romanos. Então, é o nosso conhecido já há muitos anos aqui em Edições Vida Nova. E hoje, então, é um privilégio de tê-lo aqui conosco. Eu tive essa alegria né, de trabalhar na edição brasileira do Comentário de Romanos. Meu filho teve o privilégio, meu filho Daniel, de traduzir esse comentário. E é uma alegria muito grande, então, poder conversar com o próprio autor hoje. So, back to you, Dr. and Brother Moo. I told them a lot of nice things about you, okay? So very welcome to our interview on the launching of the Romans commentary.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's good to talk with you.
Yeah. So we will have a couple of, several topics and some questions about the topics. The first one is about passion, your passion for Romans. Where does that love for Romans come from? Maybe we could rephrase that. Who inspired, or what kind of circumstances inspired you to dive so deeply into Romans?
Well, yeah, I have to answer that in 2 ways, I think. First, sort of in terms of my own personal pilgrimage as a scholar, I did my PhD work in the Gospels and taught mainly in the Gospels in my first years at Trinity Seminary, but became a little, what should I say, tired of some of the critical issues I had to keep fighting all the time, background issues in terms of Judaism and Jesus' day and so on, and just began to be attracted to the letters of Paul in particular, for their theological value, for the opportunity to really dig into some fundamental issues of that kind that are not only important in the academy, but obviously very relevant to the church. So I got interested in Paul, began to teach in Paul a little bit more. And then the second factor was I just got asked to write a commentary in Romans. So I my wife and I think, have looked at our lives, and I think we would both say that we've sort of been guided providentially by the Lord. It's not always been our smart decisions that have led us to where we are. It's the way God has opened and closed doors. So he opened a door for me to write on Romans, and I was a pretty young scholar, and I thought, oh, this is a wonderful opportunity to write a commentary on this great book of the Bible. So I kind of said, all right, I'll do it, maybe foolishly. I was pretty young yet, but decided to take on the task, and just grew over time in my appreciation of this great book.
And how young were you at that time?
I think I was offered the contract to write the commentary on Romans when I was around 35.
Wow. And that was, it was then the first edition. I mean, I have the first edition with your signature here on it. I'm proud of that.
Yeah. Well, actually, there's a little bit more of a backstory there, because I was originally asked to write in a series called the Wycliffe Exegetical Commentary that Moody Press was producing at that time. And I wrote the first volume, chapters 1 through 8, and then they pulled the plug on the series. They decided not to go ahead with the series. And so I was sort of left with an orphan, half a commentary on Romans. But in God's providence, Gordon Fee, who was then editing the New International Commentary series, contacted me because they had just their author was going to write the Romans commentary, had dropped out. They needed a Romans.
Okay.
So they contacted me and asked if I'd be willing to move my commentary over to that series, and I was very glad to do that. The NIC is a great series, so it was, again, just the providence of God that opened that door for the book to appear there. So that was the first edition in 1996, and again, the second edition, I guess, is 2018 now.
Yeah. I wanted just to comment on that again. Again, the providence of God there. Yeah. We're glad. Yeah, we're glad for that. People usually are curious about what it takes to write a book, especially such a commentary. So we talk about the work and the amount of work and such enterprise. I mean, can we talk about how long does it take to write such a monster like this? I mean, this is the this is the new edition to 2018, and it's even heavier than the other one, which was already somewhat heavy. Yeah. So I don't know what kind of routine does one need to write? Were you able to establish that kind of a routine, or how was that?
Yeah, I mean, I fell into something of a routine. I think I'm typical of most people writing books like this. We don't have the luxury simply of sitting in a study and writing all day long. We are usually active teachers. So I was active as, of course, a professor at Trinity during all of those years. I was engaged in ministries of various kinds in my local church and preaching in other churches around the area. So very busy doing those things, and then trying to establish some kind of a schedule where I could give myself to writing, maybe 1 day a week, maybe 1.5 days a week. So on the whole, it took close to 8 to 9 years from the time I was given the contract to produce the final commentary. And again, during those 8 or 9 years, I wasn't, of course, only writing on Romans, but doing a lot of other things as well.
Yeah, which probably will help us to see that the other question is not very useful here. If there are sponsors kind of work, I mean, you had 5 children, your wife, your family, to pay all your bills, and also to spend some time on Saturday watching their games, soccer or basketball or so. And so is there any kind of do people like publishing houses give something in advance so that you can work on, or is there, you just have to write the whole thing while you're teaching? I understand you were the chair also of the NIV translation committee, right?
Yes, although yes, that's I joined CBT, the NIV translation team, in 1997, so that was just after the commentary was published.
Okay.
And some publishers will give advances, small advances, when a contract is signed. Erdman's, who published the commentary on Romans, does not. So I didn't realize any material benefit from the commentary until after it was published and started to sell and got a percentage of royalties and so on.
So during the time of writing, you had to keep on teaching, doing all your normal work and ministry so that you could feed all those mouths at home. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was quite concerned that I would spend good time with my children. I didn't want them to suffer from my busyness in ministry or my writing of books or something. So that was a priority for me all along.
Very good. Yeah. Well, talking about sources or resources, and the response you gave me to your paper, I just mentioned that in a conversation with Dr. Moo a couple of minutes ago, that I still have that paper he gave me back here with a lot of good suggestions to improve my work. And since he had that wonderful system of turning in the first draft in class for a class, and then 2 weeks later you could turn in the second draft, and it was much better with all those suggestions. And one of the suggestions here was, make good use and go after, now locate and use the best academic resources. And I remember in class you saying also that since I had a German background and knew German, I should have read more of the German authors, which I did then for the second draft. Yeah. How does one evaluate good sources and resources? Is there a way to find out how did you come up with? I mean, you of course use the best resources for your commentary.
Yeah, it's particularly in a subject like Romans and the theology of Paul. There's so much written. It's just a barrage of material, articles and books. It seems to me that for every book I read on Paul, 2 more are published. So I'm never going to catch up. It's important to discriminate. Try to find the best sources, sometimes deliberately seeking out people that disagree with my own theological view, so I learn from them and challenged to think through my own ideas well. And sometimes you begin working through other commentaries on Romans that are well known, well established, and you begin to see who do those people footnote, who do they refer to, and so you sort of begin to build up a kind of basic framework, a basic number of really good commentaries. But then, sometimes there are surprises too. You have to read widely enough so that, sometimes books don't get a lot of press, they don't get a lot of attention, but they might be very valuable. And so one has to be alert to that. It's a real challenge to kind of handle that bibliography, as it were, particularly in an area like Romans and Paul.
Yeah, and probably because of that, your bibliography grew from 8 pages in your first edition of the commentary to over 120 pages.
But there's an important thing you have to realize here. In the first edition, we did not do a full bibliography.
Oh, okay.
So that was a decision we made in the second edition to produce a full bibliography of every work I cited. We did not do that in the first edition. So yes, there were more sources certainly to look at, but the main reason for the difference in length was the decision, again, to publish a full bibliography in the second volume.
So it's not only due to 20-some years time span that appeared so much more, but because of that decision you made.
It's exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, speaking about the epistle and the commentary itself, I mean, you mentioned in the book, and maybe you want to summarize that here. How did you end up with the gospel as the main topic of the epistle? I mean, there are so many suggestions for Romans.
Yeah.
Many go in the way of, justice, God's justice or justification, and so on. And your main topic is the gospel.
Yeah, Romans touches on a lot of key theological ideas, and it's easy to seize on one of those. In recent scholarship, for instance, a lot of focus has been given to the way Paul is concerned about integrating the Gentiles into the people of God, and a whole host of issues surrounding that particular issue. Traditionally, particularly among Protestants, justification has been seen as the topic of Romans. But it seemed to me that some of these were too narrow. They didn't encompass all of Romans very well. And I began to notice that in both the introduction to Romans, beginning of chapter 1, and the conclusion of Romans, basically the middle of chapter 15 through the end of chapter 16, the language of gospel was quite prominent there. So it seemed to me that the language of gospel, in a sense, framed the letter in that way. And of course, we often cite Romans 1:16 to 17 as a key statement about what Romans is all about. But again, we sometimes forget that the first key word in that statement is gospel. For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God to salvation, and so on. So yes, salvation, justification, faith all come there, but gospel is a leading term. So it seemed to me a term broad enough to encompass just about everything Paul was doing in Romans.
I know it would be very difficult to imagine this, and of course, according to the providence of God, it was his decision that Romans be part of the canon. But in your opinion, which would be the main things that would be lacking in our theology, especially in the teaching of salvation, if we did not have Romans?
Yeah, I was interested to see the question when you warned me about that ahead of time. Never really thought about that in those terms, so it's an interesting thing to consider. First of all, I think I would want to be cautious about saying we might lose something really basic in our theology if any book of the Bible sort of was dropped out or something. Because I think the things that are important for us to learn are repeated in enough places, they're touched on in enough places in the Bible that we can have confidence that we're going to find them. But I think we would be a little impoverished without Romans in terms of some of the understanding of how the cross works. How does Jesus' cross, his death on the cross, atone for sins? Here I think of Romans 3:21 to 26, this passage where Paul delves into that in a way that I don't think he or other authors do anywhere else. I also think Paul's teaching on Israel in Romans 11. People debate that text. I have my own view of it, in which I think Paul is probably asserting some kind of future for ethnic Israel in terms of salvation. And that theme of a future for ethnic Israel is not one you see really elsewhere in Paul. So I'm not sure we would completely lose that idea without Romans, but certainly we would lose a key testimony to it.
And as you said, we would be impoverished.
Yeah, exactly.
Good way to see it.
Yeah.
Would not probably not lose at all, but of course be impoverished because of that. Yeah. Along the years, I mean, after the first edition, 20-some years, and now already almost 5 years after the second edition, what kind of reaction, reader response do you get from not only from your readers? Let's have maybe two answers here: readers and also your peers. I mean, is there a way of measuring this response so it becomes really useful information?
Yes and no. Certainly, I'm concerned to hear what other people think, and a number of the reviewers of both the first and the second volume have pointed out areas of weakness, and they're probably right. I think any book ever published is going to have points of weakness, and when you try to write on a book as complicated, as long as Romans, no matter how many words you spend on it, you're probably going to miss some things. You're probably going to have some things that are a little imbalanced. So, I take some of that criticism to heart and understand that it's fair. I think in my ideal audience for the commentary, though, and you have to have kind of an audience in view as you write, my ideal audience was the informed pastor, and to some extent the student of Paul. So I wasn't so much thinking of my audience as fellow scholars, but as pastors who were reading the commentary to help them prepare for a sermon series or a Sunday school class or something of that sort. I've been gratified, to be honest, at the reaction. So many people in different parts of the world, when I teach in different parts of the world, they express appreciation for the commentary and what they've learned from it. So that has been a great encouragement for me to continue. And one of the reasons I did a second edition, I thought, well, if the first edition's been useful, maybe it would be useful to update things, to integrate some issues that have surfaced a little bit more in recent years and in past years, to include some of the most recent bibliography, because the book seemed to be useful to people. And, I took that to heart.
Well, good. Influence in terms, in practical terms of people's lives, or even in teaching, is there anything you would add to that response? Have people mentioned how they were influenced in their personal lives, or how that helped them teaching? You said you had a lot of response to that. I heard that, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, again, a lot of people expressing help, pastors, using it to prepare a preaching series and so on. But yeah, I also received comments about how the commentary has really helped people to deepen their own spiritual life, to appreciate all the good things God has given us in the gospel. And that has touched people's lives and, had a transformative influence at times. And again, I'm just very humbled to think that anything I have written has had that kind of a usefulness. And we all, of course, have to acknowledge the work of the Spirit at that point in the lives of people.
Yeah. Well, there are, of course, some practical things, issues that people ask. A lot of difficult issues in the book of Romans and the letter to the Romans, and we won't be able to touch on all of them. But talking to Jonathan today, we were preparing for our interview here, and he asked one of the main questions in Romans, which comes from chapter 7. Is Paul talking about himself or about Israel, or what is the issue there? I know I have the somebody asked me about that recently. You worked on Douglas Moo's Romans commentary, right? Yeah. What does he say about who is the person or the entity that Paul is talking about? And I found the final paragraph here, but I won't read it because you are here in person. Why not let you talk about it?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about that passage in the first edition of the commentary, certainly. So, as you work through a book like Romans, all of it is somewhat complicated, but some parts are a lot more difficult than others.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the identity of the person in Romans 7 and following, who is this person Paul's talking about, struggling, trying to do the right thing and finding himself doing the wrong thing, under submission to the law, subject and imprisoned by the law, and so forth. Good theologians and biblical scholars have come down on different sides. So that's the first thing one has to acknowledge. There are really good people who have written very strongly and persuasively on all sides of the issue. I became persuaded and remain persuaded that Paul is talking about his own life under the law in solidarity with the people of Israel. So that this is not Paul's conversion experience, but a reflection on his experience as a Jew under the law before he came to Christ. And that's a view that is probably not the most popular one among most of my theological comrades. I'm sort of put myself in kind of a Reformed Baptist category, but generally Reformed. And on the whole, people from the Reformation tradition have thought this is Paul himself. Paul is a Christian speaking. So I kind of put myself at odds with a lot of my friends and colleagues here, but still stubbornly convinced I'm right.
Well, there are several of this kind of issues in Romans. Yeah,
there certainly are.
You have to come down on one side, but as you mentioned, there are good people who think a little differently there. Yeah.
Sure.
Well, I personally have a difficulty ever since 20-something in Bible school, and that was Romans 5:12. Do we all sin because we inherited it, or are we all sinners because we inherited sin and that's why we sin, or are we all sinners because each and one of us sins? So on this, I don't remember. I didn't look up your final paragraph on that.
Yeah, again, another one of these issues. That's what I've called over the years both the fascination and the frustration of Romans. Every chapter throws you deeply into theological controversial waters, and so you have to think, about some of these major issues. But yeah, first of all, on that passage in Romans 5:12-21, what's fundamentally important is to recognize Paul is wanting to emphasize the universality of sin. And we might have different ways of getting there, but it's important that we recognize what is clear, that we can all agree on. That's important for us to agree on, because obviously that stimulates our evangelism once we recognize that indeed all humans, everyone I come in contact with, no matter how good their life might appear to be, outside of Christ, they're under the power of sin. They need Jesus. They need salvation. Specifically, I do think that Paul probably is suggesting that people sin in and because of Adam, so that his sin becomes a kind of a representative sin for all humans. I think that's the most likely reading of the passage.
Okay, yeah, that's very helpful. And as you said, the most important thing here is that we all recognize, either way, how it came to us, that we are sinners. We are sinners, and so we need to repent and need forgiveness and need Christ's death and Christ's life instead of ours. And so, yeah. Well, as we mentioned before already, there is a huge expectation for the Brazilian Vida Nova publisher edition of your commentary. A month ago or so, I just recorded a short video, 59 seconds. It's that perfect video for Instagram. And just mentioned, well, here we are almost finishing Romans. And in 2 or 3 days, it had 35,000 views. So people, and a lot of comments. So the expectation is really very high here. So we're happy for that. What kind of, final summarizing word of encouragement would you have for our readers here in Brazil of this Vida Nova edition of the commentary?
Well, as I've said, as I've had reactions, particularly from the first edition for many years, just pray that people find it useful, that Portuguese pastors, students, lay people even, who want to dig into the Word can find the commentary useful. They don't have to agree, obviously, with everything I say, but maybe it'll stimulate their thinking and enable them to dig a little bit more into the Word and be transformed by it. That's always the hope.
Yeah, and I think at the beginning, before we started the interview, you already saw something of a possible cover of the book. This is, as I already showed you, English edition here. And the Portuguese edition will look like the series here we have. This is First Corinthians, Gordon
Very
Fee.
nice.
So you're in good company here.
Indeed.
Yeah. So we have already several. We have Mark by Robert Stein. We have Colossians and Philemon. Philemon, is that how you say it in English?
Normally Philemon up here, yes.
Yeah. By Greg Beale. And then First Peter, Karen Jobs. Philippians, also Gordon Fee. Then, of course, the first one was Grant Osborne, Revelation. This was the first one, was very good to work on this one. And also one already in the series of the Old Testament, Leviticus by Gordon Wenham. So these are your comrades here, your colleagues here.
Well, I'm glad to see that you're working on Old Testament as well, because we have a kind of almost an overabundance in English, at least, of commentaries on the New Testament, but not as many on the Old. So we really need some catching up there, I think.
Yeah, and we're working. People sometimes when I do some kind of videos here, I show them the next one to come. So we have Ephesians coming, the next one by Harold Hoehner. So you know him also. And then we have Hebrews by F.F. Bruce coming out. And as at your request, we have more Old Testament here. And that is the New American Commentary, Judges and Ruth. I studied this one with Lawson Younger at Trinity, the commentary by Daniel Block. So these are the next ones to come out here, and so we're happy that we're making progress with that series here in Brazil.
Very glad to hear it's moving ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So we thank you very much, Brother Moo, for all your effort in teaching, as I already mentioned. Personally, I'm very grateful for your teaching, for the way you challenged me, helped me a lot. It improved my work. For your all your work in writing, and so multiplying the experience and the knowledge the Lord has given you, so that a lot of people around the world can benefit from that. And also for spending some time here with us for this interview.
Very glad to do it.
Yeah, may God continue to bless you, renew your strength, and why not pray for and hope that sometime you can come down here to Brazil. Maybe not in the middle of the semester.
Well, I have more free time. I'm retiring from Wheaton at the end of June, so I'm going to be much more flexible with my time.
Right.
One of the advantages.
Yeah, so let's plan and think about that, about some possibilities here.
Sure.
So thank you very much, and God bless you and your family.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Goodbye.